Okay, so last week, of course, we continue our discussion in the history of capitalism. Last week, we looked at class and class formation under capitalism. We looked at how two distinct classes emerged, right? The owners of capital and the means of production, and those who sell their labor because they lack capital and access to the means of production. The bourgeoisie, of course, were the ones that owned capital and the means of production, and the proletariat was everybody else, those who sold their labor and lacked access to the means of production. And of course, we complicated this a little bit. There were divisions even within these two distinct classes. Within the bourgeoisie, there are different sectors of capital. Finance capital sometimes has different interests than industrial capital versus agrarian capital, and etc. And within the proletariat, there are also differences. We looked at how differences get produced or exploited, factors such as gender, race, ethnicity, but it's also things like skill, unskilled, knowledge workers versus general laborers, these kinds of things as well. Now today what we're going to do is continue that discussion, because a lot of what we were looking at in terms of class and class formation was how capitalism operates. And that's really where we're turning our attention to today. Today we will be looking at the logic of capitalism, how it functions, what processes occur under it, how it changes society. And specifically our focus will be on commodities, the division of labor, and markets. Now what I'm going to do here is just give a very short introduction, and then I'm going to probably do 3 separate videos, one looking at commodities, one looking at the division of labor, and then finally one looking at markets. So before we get into those videos, first what we're going to do here is define our key concepts. Okay, so now this lecture is going to be a little shorter, I think, than previous lectures, and that's partly because we're dealing with a much more abstract concepts here, right? The first couple of weeks of the course, particularly the transition to feudalism, the rise of merchant capital, and the role of the state and imperial expansion, were very concrete, right? We looked at these sort of narratives of history and how capitalism weaved itself through, how it was driving history, that kind of thing. And then last week we got a little bit more abstract. Some of you during the discussion were a little bit more concerned about sort of the philosophical nature of what we were talking about. And it can be a little bit more challenging, it's a little bit denser. And now today is even more abstract than last class. Now I'm going to try to take these sort of abstract concepts and explain them as best I can in the most concrete way that we can, okay? So the 3 things that we're looking at are commodities, division of labor, and markets. Now, a commodity, put very simply, is an external object, a thing which through its qualities satisfies human needs of whatever kind, and that it is then exchanged for something else, right? So a shoe is a commodity, a watch is a commodity, your computer is a commodity, right? Clothing can be a commodity, food is a commodity, even experiences can be a commodity. And the other thing we're going to look at is the division of labor. Now, this is a fairly straightforward one that we'll go into much greater detail in, just like commodities. But by way of introduction, it is simply the rationalization of the production or labor process, in which complex tasks, usually done by one person / laborer or a craftsman, is broken down into simpler and simpler component parts, right? So, under the artisanal system, we had one person making a shoe, and they were involved in the entire process from start to finish. Under a division of labor, you might have one person making the laces, one person doing the leather work, one person polishing the leather, one person assembling it, one person boxing it, right? And it allows for a much more efficient form of production where they can produce a lot more shoes, right? And of course, if you produce a lot more shoes, it means and leads us to our next concept, which is markets. You need a bigger market. So a market, of course, is something that, to put simply, is the medium through which different commodities are exchanged, especially qualitatively different commodities, right? So how do you determine the value of commodities? Well, that's often determined in a marketplace. Now, we're going to look at each individual concept here in its own separate video. Now, they do overlap. I'm sure as some of you, when you were reading, looking at the readings for this week, realized that the reading on markets talked a lot about the division of labor and commodities. The readings on commodities talked a lot about the division of labor and vice versa. So there obviously is overlap, but I'm going to try to separate them to try to explain it as simply as I can. And again, because these concepts are very abstract, feel free to email me or come to my office hours tomorrow or next week. Even though next week's off, I might still do them if you guys want me to. But these are abstract concepts. So I will do office hours again next week, just because it's before the exam, even though it's reading week technically. So feel free to come and see me. Okay, so that's going to be the introduction. The next video, what we're going to do is look at commodities, specifically defining them, what commodification is, and all that sort of thing. Okay, so let's leave it at that for now.